Everyone, and welcome to the Public Safety Committee meeting. We actually have only one item today, Bill 1821, which is the police, the internal affairs procedures and reporting requirements. We did have at one point two items on the agenda. However, the lead sponsor for Bill 1721 requested that it be postponed and rescheduled, and we certainly are accommodating that as well. I'd like to welcome the other committee members, Council President Hucker, Council Vice President Albernaz, as well as I see that the Chief Jones is here, and Lee Holland from the Fraternal Order of Police is here as well. The lead sponsor of this bill happens to be President Hucker, so I'm going to turn to him first and ask if he has any comments as we begin.
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have any opening remarks. I think everybody, just as a reminder, because it's been a little while since this was introduced, this bill was really a response to the information we received about the incident that occurred in East Silver Spring Elementary School with a 5-year-old child who was sort of, lectured, abused, handcuffed by a couple of our officers. And then, of course, many of us had concerns that we found out about the incident so late. So I'm grateful to all the stakeholders for the thought that went into this bill. Very grateful to Ms. Wellens for all the time she put into this. I think we have a good start in the drafting the bill, and I'm eager to get to the work session so we can work through all the details. But I'm grateful to the chief and all the stakeholders and all the co-sponsors for their support. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Albernaz, do you have anything to add?
Nope. Well, I shouldn't say no, because then I'm about to add something. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank the bill's sponsor, and I really appreciate the deliberate manner in which our council president went about researching and in the development of this bill. He engaged with the key stakeholders here, which I think as a general practice is certainly not just the right thing to do, but provides us with a much stronger starting point in discussions like this through our work session. And while there obviously are many elements, technical, certainly complex, with numerous layers, I just want to state that up front. It just is so helpful as we have these conversations when some of the due diligence and homework was done on the front end. And in my opinion, it helps ensure not just a more effective piece of legislation, but one that will be more easily embraced and then implemented, which is ultimately what we all want. So I just kind of wanted to say that as a standard practice. I think it's a good one. So thank you to our bill sponsor for that.
Thank you.
With that, I don't have anything else to say up front. I'm going to have a bunch of questions, but I'll defer to you, Mr. Chairman, as we walk through the packet.
Thank you very much. And we're going to get to the packet, but Chief or Mr. Holland, do you have anything else to add before we get to the packet?
No, the only thing I would add, good morning to the committee. I would just note that, again, we are, committed to working hand in hand to work out through these issues and get more into the details of, again, it's not a very simplistic process, but we're committed to working with you all in order to, again, to work towards accountability and trust. So thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And Mr. Holland.
Good morning, committee. I just want to thank President Hucker for reaching out while he was drafting this bill and working with us on this bill. I think it's important to have. I wish it was policy beforehand, but this is where we are now, and I'm glad I'm here today so we can work through this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Wellens, thank you again. I think you've gotten a lot of thank yous, but you're not getting enough on all your hard work on this. But if it's, I think the best way to go through this is to the chiefs and others' point. This can be a little complex, so we would like you to please lead us through the packet from points from the beginning. And then I'm going to ask my colleagues and others, as we go through each point, we should stop and discuss it, because if we wait till the end, that can get lost as well. So with that, Ms. Wellens, thank you for all your hard work. Please lead us through the packet.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, council members, Chief, Mr. Holland. Good morning, Ms. Roberts. So I will attempt to lead you through the packet. Just as a preliminary remark, well, two things. One, housekeeping, which is that staff being me, inadvertently left Council Vice President Albornoz off as a co-sponsor. He's a co-sponsor of this legislation. And then more to the substance. So, I mean, as you know, this bill is an effort to improve police accountability through really two different mechanisms. One relates to internal reporting of within the police department, within the county government, really, of certain types of serious incidents, and also the reporting of those incidents in a timely manner to the state's attorney. And then the other main aspect of the bill relates to issuance and use of body-worn cameras, and actually really focuses on the review of body-worn camera footage, requiring that there be random periodic review of such footage, and that certain incidents discovered through such random review be, elevated through the chain of command. So with that, I'll go into issue number one, which is kind of the broad issue that, I mean, as we all know, the Maryland Police Accountability Act that passed in the General Assembly this most recent session touches on many issues related to police operations throughout the state. One of those issues is body-worn cameras. So I just note here in the packet that the provisions related to body-worn cameras really don't explicitly affect Montgomery County until 2025, interestingly. But essentially, it's requiring the county to conform to guidelines issued by the state related to body-worn cameras. The state already has some guidelines in effect, which really, I think it's fair to say that our police department's already following those guidelines, and more guidelines and more specificity might be forthcoming. But that just provides a little bit of background that's relevant to the bill. In that same vein, I wanted to note for the committee that, of course, the preliminary external audit of the police department came out at the end of June, and there are a number of observations, recommendations within that preliminary audit that have some bearing on this bill, some ways in which it dovetails with the recommendations dovetail with the bill. Obviously this doesn't address all of the recommendations or even all of the recommendations related to body-worn cameras, so the committee may or may not want to delve further into that, but that's noting for your background. So that's actually issues number one and issue number two in the staff memorandum, providing that context and background. Issue number three, which starts on page 5, brings up, a complex issue of the scope of mandatory reviews by the Internal Affairs Division. So some advocates have suggested that the bill should be amended in order to require IAD to automatically, first of all, to require IAD to be the ones to conduct the random reviews of body-worn camera. That's kind of jumping to another issue in our memorandum, but that certain types of incidents would automatically have to be referred to IAD, and that they would have to review them. The staff recommendation, or the staff kind of observation on this, is that the committee might want to look at this issue in the broader context of implementing the Police Accountability Act, because As you know, the Police Accountability Act is going to require us to create an administrative charging committee and related to civilian complaints, and as well as the Police Accountability Board. In addition, so there are police policies, which certainly the chief or Ms. Roberts could speak to, related to, when something is automatically, necessarily reviewed by IAD versus when something is reviewed by a supervisor, or perhaps when something is an EEO complaint and is reviewed by another arm or another agency. So this is just to say that, this is a complex issue. My understanding of the intended scope of the bill was, kind of looking at the random review of body cameras and when those issues would be elevated to IAD. But there is this, for the committee's benefit, and in case you would like further research done on this, there is just a larger scope of just in general, if a supervisor becomes aware of something, when does it go to IAD? When does it not? It's a complex issue, as I said. I'll just pause there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. First off, when would the state legislation kick in for this part of the state legislation? Would it be before 2025? What is the timeline on that?
Yeah, so for this part of the legislation related to the formation of the police accountability boards, that will go into effect in July 2022. However, and Mr. Holland could speak to this as well, there is essentially a grandfathering in of the current collective bargaining agreements as they pertain to these issues, and our collective bargaining agreement, as I understand it, goes until 2023. So there is, a little bit of time, but it's not as far out as 2025 as with the other provisions that we discussed.
So this one, if I'm hearing you correctly, and please correct me if I'm not, this one we could not change at this point under state law or under the way the collective bargaining has taken place until 2023. We'd have to work on how we're going to change it before 2023, but the actual change could not occur until July of 2023. Am I correct in that?
Well, partially, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. It's just such a complex issue because, I think that you could legislate now in this area, but being mindful that, look, by 2023, some of these things would have to potentially be upended and a new system put into place. And in terms of the collective bargaining agreement, that's obviously a complex question as well. And, so it might depend on the specific changes that the committee would want to make and whether those are consistent with the current state law, the law as it will be in a couple of years, and the existing collective bargaining agreement. So, I don't want to say that categorically, no, you couldn't legislate in this area, but it would be kind of threading the needle.
Okay. Council Vice President Albornoz.
Thank you. So I'm open to threading the needle. I think that there's an opportunity for us, in advance of the very real and understandable and reasonable issues that are on the horizon. But I do think this is an opportunity for us, especially with all the parties involved here, for us to be able to craft something that makes sense. I have come to, as I've said many times, my colleagues have heard me say this, really appreciate and respect the council's process, both through public discourse, community engagement, stakeholder engagement, but these work sessions, I think, can be extraordinarily productive and helpful. And I think the key stakeholders are around this Zoom room right now. And so I'm open to, Mr. Chairman, seeing what we can do here to push a little bit within reason, acknowledging some of those, again, reasonable parameters, but to see what we can do to advance as much as possible, because there's urgency, as we all know. There was just an incident recently this past weekend, and with the FOP at the table and management as well, and the recommendations we've already received from the Reimagining Task Force, plus the advisory groups that have been established by this body. We have so much rich assistance and help, and of course the community folks that have also provided some really good feedback too. So I think we've got the constellation of elements here and data to be able to come up with something that makes sense, that may mean for at least some of these elements we don't have to wait until some of those other elements come to place. So I just kind of want to let you know the lens that I'm going to be looking at this from, and for that context.
I actually am in very much agreement with what you said. I think that anything that we do prior to that it would actually take effect, that it should keep in mind what will take effect in 2023 or whatever that date is. But if we can do it sooner, I think all the public, the police, everyone involved would be better off if we can do it sooner. So that would be my goal as well. I understand that it's easier said than done, but I do think if we don't try to do it, that it's not going to take place. So I'm fine with that. And President Hucker, I don't know where you are at this moment on this one. I have a feeling I do, but go ahead. And you might be frozen. Mr. President, are you on? I think he's frozen. I'm going to text him, but no, he's off. Okay. All right. He's coming back, I'm sure. So anyhow, Ms. Wellens, you've heard, Mr. President, you're back. You were frozen for a moment there.
I apologize. It was probably
not a problem. And did you hear what we were saying?
Well, certainly the beginning of it. I think I'm aligned with you and the Council Vice President just on using this opportunity. When the bill was drafted, we didn't have, of course, the benefit of the external audit and their recommendations. So, yeah, no, I don't know if you feel like you're prepared to work on this today, or whether we should gather, a staff recommendation and talk to stakeholders, or whether there's stuff we can do. But I think I agree with you and Gabe on the merits.
And I'm happy to continue to work on this part of it today as well, but I don't know how much more we could actually do. Ms. Wellens, any suggestions on that?
I would suggest if the committee wishes to delve into some of the larger issues of what IAD automatically reviews, I believe that would probably require another work session and more work with the stakeholders to be most productive on it.
Okay, let me ask the chief and Mr. Holland as well. How practical is it that a supervisor would, I guess, look at tapes every day? I mean, how much time would that take, and how much, if the officers are working an 8-hour shift, how long would the supervisor have to look at all the officers in order to do this? I mean, I'm trying to look at the practical side of what we're attempting to do. We all understand what we'd like to have done, but it has to be practical as well. Any idea on that?
So what I would, if we're looking at our generally the average number of officers on any given shift,
yeah,
and that fluctuates from district to district based upon how districts are established. But you could be looking at anywhere from 8 officers to approximately 12 officers in most cases. There may be some shifts that are smaller in nature, but I would give you that would be about our average of shifts. And if you're looking at a random number of officers on your shift on a daily basis, I would suggest to you that would take a considerable amount of time, depending upon the length of videos. I mean, you go to some calls for service, you may only be there for 5 or 6 minutes. You may go to some calls for service, you may be there for an incredibly larger amount of time, maybe 30 minutes. And so if you're looking at random review, I would suggest that would take generally 3 to 4 hours out of a workday. Now, one of the things, a sergeant has many responsibilities, and many of those responsibilities include monitoring radio traffic, the calls for service that are actually being handled, dispatch. He has authority, or she has authority for any dispatch calls to re-divert them or hold them, depending upon what's happening. There are also responsibilities of that supervisor to actually respond to scenes, to address any issue and deal with any other issue of the public. So I would suggest it's going to be an added workload to those supervisors to have to do random views on a daily basis of their officers who work under their commands.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I asked the question. And secondly, I would assume that they couldn't do their work until after the shift. Or, I mean, they might be able to do some, but they might. So how would that work?
Well, they have a lot of responsibilities. They have report review, that all reports that are written by their officers at the end of the shift, that they have to make sure that those reports are correct. There is and if it's not correct, there's a process which the report is returned to the officer to make those corrections, but also to make sure that those reports are in on a timely basis. And generally the supervisors are the last ones they'll leave. But, to say that we want to add a considerable amount of time to their already 10-hour plus workday, I think that, that could be a little bit of a challenge. So when we look at process about exactly how do we go about doing random reviews, I think there's a lot of dynamics that we need to really think about how to actually implement that process, and whose responsibility is that.
And Mr. Holland, do you have anything else to add on this one, or?
Yeah. So now, the agreement now is that all uses of forces are already reviewed at the shift level at the end of the shift. So when an officer turns in a use of force report, that is already being reviewed by the sergeant by the end of the shift. So they're already looking at those cameras. I think it's important to know that Axon, which is our body camera, has a program called Performance, which actually has a thing in for random reviews. They will pull out the random videos. They'll assign the random videos. I think it all determines on how many random videos are you trying to review on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis. That would determine how much is actually going to be involved in this. I didn't think it was going to be on a daily basis at the shift level. I thought it'd be maybe at the station level, so many a month, but that determined, this is how we're going to determine it now. It wasn't written in the bill itself. So I think it's important to add.
Mr. Hucker, President Hucker, did you have anything to add? I see you shaking your head. I couldn't tell whether you want to add something.
No, I don't. I'm just nodding furiously in complete agreement. Thank you.
All right, and so, and Mr. Vice President, please jump in on this one as well. But I believe what we should do is ask Ms. Wellens to go back and have these good discussions with stakeholders and figure out what's a practical way to get to a better place than where we are at this moment as quickly as possible, keeping in mind that there might be staffing shifts and everything else necessary on this. Are we in agreement or not on that one? Council Vice President's okay. Council President, you're okay on that too. So Ms. Wellens, we've given you the very easy task to try to figure out what's the best solution on this, but you do hear us, so we want We want a solution on this, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to continue to work on it with the stakeholders. I would just note there are really, I think there are two related but distinct issues of, what is IID required to review versus like what exactly does the random review that the bill calls for look like? And so those might have different, like staffing ramifications, for example. So short answer, yes, go back to the drawing board and work on this.
And I appreciate what you're saying on that as well. If we want something different, but if we do something different, we need to make certain that the staffing is there so that we can be successful from all sides on what we're doing different. So anyhow, that's also part of this. Once this were to take effect, we have to have people in place that can make certain that this can be done efficiently and properly. Okay. Ms. Wellens, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with that, placeholder, I'll take the committee to item number 4 in the staff memorandum, which relates to the scope of mandatory internal reporting. This one may or may not be more manageable for purposes of this work session. So as you know, the bill calls for monthly internal reporting from IAD to the chief and more swift reporting depending upon the nature of the underlying incident. Some advocates, the Silver Spring Justice Coalition has recommended a couple of amendments on this issue. One is that that when reports are made to the chief regarding demographic information of individuals involved in the incident, that explicitly that demographic information would include, include race, ethnicity, and gender information. That would be a minimum regarding the residents involved in the matter. So that is the amendment that you see at the top of page 6, or the potential amendment. And then the other amendment would be that with respect to the monthly reports to the chief, that information about the source of the investigation would be included, including whether does the investigation arise from a random review that's required under the bill, or a complaint, another source. So those are those potential amendments, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. President Hocker, do you have a comment on this as a potential amendment?
I favor this amendment. The core of the bill is to increase, I should have said this at the beginning, but it's really obviously to increase transparency, and by increasing transparency, increase our ability to perform our oversight function and increase public confidence in the police force, which is in everyone's interest, especially the police force. So, I think this is sort of well thought out and enhances the bill. And it doesn't seem like a burdensome reporting requirement to just include the nature, the date, the name, the source. That's shouldn't be very time consuming from my point of view.
And Vice President Albornoz, are you okay with it as well?
I am. I would like to hear from Chief to get his thoughts generally on this specifically, and if there are any issues with implementation. But in principle, I agree with this amendment as well.
And we're going to hear from the Chief, as do I. I believe the more information we can get, the more information we can give, the more we can be transparent. And that's the idea of all of this. So, Chief, do you have any comment on this?
Yes, I mean, I don't see any significant, there are no issues on our part, at this point, that internal affairs already reported, is a direct report to me at the chief's office already. I receive weekly updates from the Internal Affairs Division on complaints. I have internal information on investigations that we have that are currently in motion or pending outcomes. So this is not a heavy lift on our part to provide that type of information as requested.
Very good. And Mr. Holland?
I would think this information is already provided to the chief during IAD, so I don't see any reason why this shouldn't be reported now in this bill. So
Very good. I think without objection, Ms. Wellens, we're going to ask that this be an amendment that's included.
Thank you, Mr.
I did
Chair.
have I totally concur with the action that we just took, but I did have a question that's more general and fundamental, but I think, just for my own information would be helpful. Chief, I guess what kind of training goes into observing the body, the video? How do we, it's a lot to process and a lot to see, but I would imagine that, there's a training that goes on with what officers and those that are watching the body-worn camera video, they know what to look for, they know what to see, and as opposed to a lay citizen or person. But could you just, from 30,000 feet and as detailed as you can make it, describe a little bit what that looks like, what that training looks like? Because it's relevant to this entire discussion. And I've always just been curious and would like to know what sort of training goes into observing these tapes. And from a general standpoint, what are you looking for? What are you not looking for? And I know, as is the case in this recent, most tragic incident this past weekend, the body-worn cameras are an important part, but part of the data points that you all utilize and access and recreating or investigating, including using other tapes available from security cameras, et cetera. So there's a lot that goes into it, but it would be helpful for me and maybe our public as well to just better understand what training goes into the looking at these videos.
So first of all, we have an extensive amount of training on our use of force policy. And we also, for supervisors, beginning at the sergeant's level, there's also a requirement, even in our testing of supervisors, the process of a promotional process is that they have to be well-versed in understanding use of force and laws and policy that requires, them to understand what is the proper use of force. And again, every case is different. But that is one of the first things that they have to do in order to be able to identify when someone improperly uses force in any given situation. I think President Holland also noted that there is a review not only from a supervisory level, but also from an executive level. Every use of force report that is actually documented and also the event report is presented to the executive at the district command or the division command. And that there are executives who are at a higher level who understand and who have been trained and previously in use of force to know to be able to identify potential wrongdoing. And that's their job, is that when they see things that they potentially think are improper uses of force, then they are supposed to push those reviews to the Internal Affairs Division. That is a direction that I have provided, and and we've been following that process for some time. That every video is observed. The district commander also observes that video, or division director. And if there is something that needs to be looked into further, it is not at their point that they are making a definitive decision, but it is to be reviewed by Internal Affairs. We also bring in experts in use of force who have extensive training, not only through our training academy, but through extensive training throughout other venues across the country, specifics to police use of force, knowing what is proper and what is improper. And so the Internal Affairs Division in their investigation will also obtain, to have that review done and to have an opinion. And then at the end of the day, that review is then submitted to our internal review panel, which consists of our legal representation from the county attorney's office, as well as our assistant chiefs who are on the panel, who then review and after that investigator has completed that investigation, will make that recommendation. If there's a belief that there's improper uses of force, then they would sustain charges and make those recommendations to myself as the chief. And if there is where they believe that the use of force was proper, it is well documented in that particular complaint. Whether, again, that's from the body-worn camera video footage alone. There's also the potential that there is allegations from a complainant, an external complainant, who may have been involved or witnessed what they think is an improper use of force. And again, that same process is then submitted to Internal Affairs, and that division again begins their investigation. And if there is body-worn camera footage or any other evidence that supports that, then that is actually utilized or brought into the investigation by that Internal Affairs investigator. And then that case is then also presented to that review panel, as I noted. So there are multiple ways for that to occur, but I will tell you that we take it very seriously to have individuals who are well versed in use of force to be able to know what is proper and what is improper.
That's really helpful. So if I'm hearing you correctly, just to confirm, so you have the folks that are watching these videos and making determinations on what did or did not happen, obviously have a myriad of training in both the policies and practices of the department. But I wonder, just again, so sort of the naked eye, because these video images can be complex, and I would imagine that it reverts back to some level of training to some degree. And policies are important and they're critical and they're important to transparency, but they're a gray area sometimes. Sure. With regards to these incidents that leave some level of interpretation. We're all human beings, and it's impossible to put ourselves entirely in the minds of everyone that was involved in these incidents. And so I'm just, in addition to being well versed and trained in the policies and practices that are in black and white, that we are holding everyone to the appropriate standard for, but I would imagine there's a human element to the training as well. And is there, I may be making that up, or when you look at these videos, and we all see them horrifically now so frequently on a national level, but I'm a lay citizen. I don't know what I'm looking at in every instance. And so I just wanted to hone in on that a little bit more. In addition to the myriad of policies and practices that the folks that watch these videos have to be well versed in, is there any additional training just in terms of watching video that we are or aren't doing that we may be able to look at doing? Because this is relatively new. Right. In the grand scheme of law enforcement, body-worn cameras haven't been around for very long. Right. And so we're kind of establishing not just policy, but best practices as we go here and as the technology catches up, which is constantly evolving and changing. So I didn't know if there was anything on top of that you could add that could shed light on trying to get to what I'm going for here.
So I think what's important for us to realize is that the executive review is really just the initial step. It is, and when I say that, I mean it from a perspective of that there is something that may seem to be it could be a gray area, It could be that they believe that it is totally improper. And it's not to a decision. They're not making a decision that the force was improper at that very moment. They're not. That's not the finality of it. It's to begin to spark the investigation. So that's the start of the investigation. Now, the investigators in internal affairs have specialized training to go to see body-worn camera footage, and to have an extensive amount of training that helps them to identify things in body-worn camera footage, because sometimes, as we note that sometimes it's not as clear as a lot of folks think it is, right? Because body-worn camera footage is only one piece of evidence, and involved in whether it's an internal affairs investigation or a criminal investigation. It is only one piece of the evidence. It doesn't show you everything. It shows you what the camera showed you. And some things that there's generally more to that investigation. It's more to the story. It's what did the officer see, right? It's one thing to say what the camera has captured, but the officer's interpretation of exactly what was occurring at the moment that force was utilized is an important piece of the investigation, because the human eye captures incredibly a lot more. It is generally what I just spoke about in the press conference on earlier this week, that an officer's head could be turned in one direction and his chest or her chest could be facing another direction in which the body-worn camera video is actually facing, and therefore their eyes are capturing something totally different than what the camera is capturing at that very same moment. And so therefore, if we're not having a conversation with the involved officer, and that's what internal affairs investigations actually accomplish, that we can actually ask the officer, what did you actually see at that very moment that caused you to make the action in which you made, to use force if that's the case, right? But in any case, it is the moment that allows you to assess that particular situation to see if the force was proper or improper, because there has to be more than just what we see on video. And so that is why it's important that then the investigators can marry up to some degree based upon the evidence that's presented, based upon the statements that are provided by witnesses, involved officers, all of the like. All of that has to be a complete package. And that's why we send our internal affairs investigators to additional training so that they understand how they can actually conduct a fair and impartial investigation from that standpoint, making sure that they're capturing all of those dynamics that also include the body-worn camera footage.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. I appreciate that. And then my final question for now, again, a general question. I apologize, Mr. Chair.
No apology, please.
Is just capacity and infrastructure. So, there are reams of data at this point, and obviously complex issues. And so, we want to put everybody, as we are with the previous bills that we've enacted as well, and the ones we will be considering in the future, to put everyone in the best possible position to succeed. Can you just talk a little bit, Chief, again, this is more general, about internal capacity within internal affairs, through these investigations, because we also don't want to set you all up for failure if we enact legislation and then basically give you an unfunded mandate. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so currently we have 6 investigators who are internal affairs. Thanks to the council, we were provided with 2 additional investigators that we're currently in the process of adding to the staff. And that is very helpful from that perspective. The investigations, again, as assigned, the Internal Affairs Division handles a myriad of complaints. We put out an annual report every year. When we look at the amount of complaints that come in, which can fluctuate from year to year, But, when you add not only just external complaints from our community, but we also have to address some internal issues within the department as it relates to violating policies and procedures or even laws that may happen from an internal standpoint. Sometimes it may address even employee performance as an example. It may include employee attendance. It includes off-duty behavior. And this is many things that the community doesn't necessarily hear about, but these are issues that have to be addressed within the department, and thus the workload of those investigators are generally, right now they generally are averaging anywhere from 5 to 7 cases that may be on their desk at one given time. And those timelines change as the investigation proceeds, because there are cases that may have been charges may have been sustained and issued to the involved officers, but until that case is remediated within the disciplinary process, that case is still pending. It still remains on that investigator's desk until it is completed, whether it is through the hearing board process, or whether there is an agreement with the involved and to include the FOP as well as my office, that we have a settlement of the charges that have been sustained. So that therefore that investigator is still tied to that case as the case proceeds through the adjudication process. So there are complaints that come in and are assigned by the director of the Internal Affairs Division. Again, some come through the internal mechanisms, and some come through our complaint process through our community. And every complaint is looked at. Whether we look at it from, if it's a minor complaint, such as courtesy, maybe someone complains about an officer who may be speeding or something of that nature. Those things are what we would call intakes. Those minor incidents are then pushed to the commander level, the director level, to have them look into those matters and address those matters accordingly. The more serious cases that we would consider, those are formal investigations, and those are the investigations that actually get assigned to the internal affairs investigator. So when there's that formal complaint about a improper use of force, if there's a formal complaint about maybe an officer's conduct being, conduct unbecoming of something of the sort, that they've done something wrong or some other violation that's a serious violation of our policies, then those complaints are looked into by internal affairs investigators and assigned accordingly. So, again, looking at an increased amount of work, I think, again, when we're talking about it, I would hope that when we talk about the random review of body-worn camera, if that is to be placed upon the Internal Affairs Division, we're going to need more resources. If we're talking about that, it's going to be looked at from the executive level of the police department, then we can have a different conversation about how that would actually be, because there is some review that we do now with our use of force, as I've explained. But again, there will be more resources needed if we were going to do it from the internal affairs standpoint.
Okay, thank you, Chief. That's helpful. I guess we know where you work, so I guess as we'll have opportunities to check in after the 2 additional positions that are on board, but we want to do this right. We also don't want to in any way compromise investigations if we don't have enough hands on deck. That would defeat the whole purpose of us wanting to do this in the first place. It's got to be done right if we're going to do it. So, but we have plenty of opportunities over the course of the year, whether it be through general updates or budget discussions and deliberations to evaluate this. I would just note to Ms. Wellens and I guess Ms. Farag that that's something we should be flagging, an important element and keeping track of and score of as we go through. So thank you. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, President Hucker.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Chief, for that answer. I've had a couple questions on my mind that go to both the previous question of staffing and cost, and also Council Vice President's question about training. Obviously, I'm supportive of more resources if it gets us better review and public confidence. But Chief, I want to ask you, and I guess I should probably ask Mr. Holland as well. The body-worn camera program, since we set it up, Mr. Chairman, when is it, 7 years ago now?
Something like that.
I know has improved over time. There's more functionality now that Axon offers. I'm not an expert in it at all. Can you talk about how much functionality they offer, how much of that we use, and how much specifically you use artificial intelligence to put in the key search factors to identify incidents on the front end, and before human review is necessary, or to make sure that we're catching all the incidents we should?
So you're 100% correct, Mr. Hooker. It is truly there has been an increase in the technology from the body-worn camera program since we began. Cameras have been updated. There is the availability of artificial intelligence. We are currently looking at tapping into those resources from Axon, who is our vendor for the body-worn camera technology, as well as bringing them on a platform for our mobile video cameras as well. And we are trying to, again, find ways to actually be able to tag those significant things that could be problematic and issues that surround possible misconduct, as an example. And so that is something we're currently looking at. Of course, that's a cost. And when you start to grow in that field, to gain additional capabilities of a program, it's probably again we're looking at how that cost could impact our department. And how often we would do it, but it is something that currently we are looking at as we have grown the program over the years. I mean, we have, I've identified more specific units to actually wear body-worn cameras. I implemented a policy back in January that would have our SWAT team have them on certain operations that they would wear the body-worn cameras. We're also looking at our plainclothes units. Some plainclothes units, I know, I think I saw in your recommendations in some in the packet concerning a majority of even some of our undercover officers. And I haven't been an undercover officer in my career. I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think we meant plain clothes.
But if we're talking about some plain clothes units, I'm okay with that. In fact, we've been talking about that for some time, and some things we're working with the FOP on to see how we can implement that at some point. Again, as we grow the program, and the more cameras you have, of course, the more storage and space and all of those things that you need. But I think we've been able to manage that pretty well throughout the program that we've had. So I would suggest that we need to again look, and we're looking extensively at these significant improvements and see how that can assist our department as the technology improves.
Great, thanks. And Axon offers training, of course, right, on those enhancements?
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Mr. Holland, is that all consistent with your understanding? I know you follow.
Yeah, I spoke with Axon, and I noted earlier about the performance, their package, which is called performance, which we don't have here, which we should. Again, it will cost money, money well vested, especially if we're going to go to random reviews, because that takes the human element out of this. It's purely computerized random reviews. Will be unbiased, and I believe that's important. Every year Axon's coming out with something new. I think we're on the third body camera they've made now. The third car camera's coming out, so they're updating their features every year. Again, it costs money every time you update, but if we're going to stay ahead of the game and be one of the leaders in how we use body-worn cameras, car cameras, then we got to invest and spend the money to get it.
Right. Yeah, no, Mr. Chairman, it would just, this is really helpful, and I know I probably need a whole longer briefing on this at some point, but it would definitely be my view that we want to maximize the use of the artificial intelligence, both to minimize the human cost, because I assume that's a cost savings, and to minimize the significance of any bias or perception of bias in the review process. We're never going to be able to take humans out of the process, but using the computer to broaden the search and make sure that we're guarding against bias and that we are less likely to have any incidents that slip through, I think is in everybody's interest. So I'm really interested in this topic and glad we're talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I agree with you. I'm interested as well. And Ms. Wellens, I don't know if it's Ms. Wellens or Ms. Parag or whoever, if we could get an update, please, on how much it would cost to get the performance package. I guess that's what Mr. Holland called it from Exxon. I'd be interested to know how much it would cost and how fast we could get it once we order it. I mean, I don't know whether it's something that has to be customized or whatever, but if we could get all that information, I think we should. So if it's 6 months to order it, then I think we need to think about ordering it as quickly as we can. If it's less time than that, then we would have some more flexibility. But anyhow, if my colleagues are in agreement with that, I think that would make sense. Okay. Yes, Council Vice President. Good. Okay. See a couple thumbs up. All right, Ms. Wellens, I think you're up next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that we're on page 6, item number 5 of the staff report, which relates to mandatory reporting to the state's attorney. Obviously the chief coordinates with the state's attorney already, but this would put into law a requirement that within 7 days of becoming aware of a potential criminal offense by a department employee, whether that's through the random review or through another source, that the chief would notify the state's attorney of the nature of the existence and nature of the incident. So there has been some discussion among advocates, some testimony that perhaps the time period of a 7-day time period requirement should be shortened to 48 hours. There's a potential amendment in the packet, as you can see, that would accomplish that. And I don't know if you, Mr. Chair, would like some discussion, some input from the chief about, an appropriate timeline for reporting incidents.
Thank you. And I do want to have that discussion. Chief, is there a possibility that we could have less than 7 days? I mean, there again, the word practical has to come into effect here. But is there a time is there a way that we can have less than 7 days? What's being suggested is 48 hours. I don't know that it has to be that 48 hours. It can be some other number, or it can be that number. But is there a practical side to this, please?
Yeah, I think there's a practical side. I mean, I think we could do it within 7 days. I think the 48 hours sometimes can be a little bit, could be challenging depending upon when the chief is made aware of a certain thing. And when we talk about official notification, I mean, not that we are not in contact with the state's attorney's office, and then again, anytime we've had cases where a criminal a component to that investigation of any officer is thought about, cases have been referred to the state's attorney's office immediately. And therefore, like if it comes through the internal affairs process of complaints, and we know that it has a criminal nature potentially associated with, It has been the policy from the office of the chief here for the past several years that we immediately submit this to the state's attorney's office. We assign a criminal investigator to the case, and we contact the state's attorney's office to have assistant state's attorney assigned to that case. And then we work that case in conjunction with the state's attorney's office until they decide whether or not they wish to proceed criminally or not. And so that process has already been in place. We've again, that is something that has been traditionally set out of the office of the chief. It has been, so time has never really been an issue. We don't hold on to cases, and not, again, because what people have to understand, an internal investigation does not begin until a criminal investigation is completed. And so therefore if we know that, as the chief, I have to decide that this should be submitted to the state's attorney's office for a criminal investigation, then our internal affairs process stops immediately until we get that decision from the state's attorney's office. So for me, a 3-day notice, I think, would probably be acceptable, as we can kind of like work through weekends, and I think that's a reasonable time in order to make that notification.
And is there a way, and Mr. Holland, please jump in. I know you're not going to be shy, but please jump in when you would like to. Is there a way that the criminal investigation and the internal affairs investigation could be parallel efforts, or is it necessary to what you're saying? It's necessary to wait.
I think it is necessary to wait. I know that has been a recommendation, and I think we're still having a conversation with the auditors about that, because we think that is a bad recommendation. That is not a best practice in policing. You look at your major police departments across the country, and there's a reason why it's not a best practice, is because there's a difference between a criminal investigation and an administrative investigation, and I think that would be a bad practice for us to begin to initiate.
Okay, and I see Mr. Holland shaking his head. Yes,
yeah.
I should say which way you were shaking it.
When it becomes criminal, officers have a Fifth Amendment right, so they're not going to make any statements during a criminal investigation, which is why they don't run parallel. You could do some things where witnesses are interviewed and stuff, but most of the time, internal affairs gets the packet from the criminal investigator while they're starting to do their investigation. So some things are already caught up then. So I agree that we should not do parallel investigations at this time.
Thank you. Council Vice President Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just again, back to a general comment, and I agree with everything that's been said just now. As I've shared with my colleagues and I've discussed from the dais, I went on a ride along a couple months ago, which I found really enlightening and helpful. But among the things that was really positive, and there were many that night, was the embrace of officers on body-worn cameras. It was not a conflict. This is, it's now a very standard expectation that is part of everyday work within the force. And so I think I just wanted to acknowledge the significance of that. That there was support, from officers on duty, certainly that night, and it's been my experience in the past that there haven't been objections to this inherently either. And then I'll also just note again, and Chief alluded to this, that in practice we already do so much of this. This is once again about codifying this in legislation. But I just want to acknowledge and note that as a standard practice. We have been administering and been ahead of the curve on a number of these policies, and thanks to our council president who has introduced this bill, this codifies that and helps reinforce and helps tighten and help expand in certain areas, but it just makes it infinitely easier to have such strong and willing partners with the implementation of this, both at the management level and at the rank and file and frontline level, which makes this discussion much more positive than maybe it otherwise would be in other jurisdictions.
Thank you. Valid point. President Hucker.
I agree with everything that's been said. The reason the state's attorney that I wanted to add him or her in the future to the list of people to whom incidents would have to be reported is because when I spoke to our state's attorney and asked about, this incident shortly after I found out, he said, oh yeah, well, there's nothing he could do in this sphere because he learned about it when we learned about it over a year later, and the statute of limitations for a misdemeanor had run out at that point. And he said this has happened with some regularity. So that's why he's listed in the bill. If we can improve on the timeline from 7 days and the chief is comfortable with 3 days, I think that's great. The main thing is it's a big improvement from, letting any incident slip through without his attention and go over a year. So anyway, I'm grateful for everybody's support, moving that up a little bit.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chief. Are you gonna? No, Ms. Wellens, if you could make certain that 3 days is the right way to say this, whether it should be within hours or whatever, however it's timed. I mean, obviously, we want this information, as does the public, as does the police, want this information as quickly as possible. But the information that we're giving or getting has to be correct information. So you just can't say, here it is. I mean, somebody has to make certain that you're getting as much information as we possibly can. So if you could look in what the how to actually word this with the shortest time period practical, I think we're in agreement on that. Am I right, colleagues? Yes. Okay. Ms. Wellens, we're going to move right along all the way up to number 6, I believe, please.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Number 6 pertains to defining random review of the body-worn camera recordings. As you know, the bill does require random review of the recordings, periodic random review. The NAACP has asked for greater specificity with regard to, what does that really mean? Included here is and let me back up for just a moment and say, thanks to our excellent analyst, Ms. Farag, I want to provide you with some supplemental information that this is, a best practice, that random review, particularly by an auditor, is considered, a best practice according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Also, we've looked at some other jurisdictions and how they define random. What I've seen is that a lot of jurisdictions, their police department policies, a number of them do call for random review, but they do vary quite a bit of whether this is from, sort of an independent, still within the police department, but more kind of independent audit review versus a supervisory review. And then in terms of the frequency of the review, what I've seen the most is, and I can bring this to you with greater specificity if that would be helpful as a follow-up, but there's some variation in the frequency of the review. The most common one that I saw was about a month. And then to return to this particular potential amendment, this is an effort at defining random review with some greater specificity. If we're coming back for a second work session, I would just suggest that the committee might want to, it could be defined even further. For example, to say, instead of saying that the review would occur at regular intervals, we could say at regular intervals, at least once a month, for example. The committee also, I haven't seen other departments doing this based on my review, but except maybe one or two, but you could also do a threshold of a percentage of recordings that must be reviewed. So we could bring even greater specificity to this, but this potential amendment to define random review is at least a start of that effort. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I am in agreement with, we need a random review. I agree with the concept of the amendment. I think we do need specificity. And I don't know whether the chief or Mr. Holland have any comment on that, and then I'll turn to my colleagues. But I do believe that random review is a sensible way to go. Chief, please.
So while I'm not well versed in any other department, I do have my policy and planning division looking into some best practices across the, particularly in our major city chiefs association and other the larger departments across the country. So, I mean, we'd like to be able to comment on what that looks like and how that would impact. There are some ideas that I would have about how we could go about doing a fair and just random review. But again, I think we need to look more at the technology and we need to look more at the best practices.
And we want you to comment. Mr. Holland, please.
Yeah, I support the amendment by the NAACP. I believe it's very important we have a definition of what the random review will be. And their definition to me seems pretty random, that this is truly random, that the sample size and all that. So I agree with their amendment. If we want to make it stronger, then great. But I agree we need to have a definition of what random review is.
Thank you. President Hucker or Vice President Albornoz, either one of you?
Fully agree.
Very good. Ms. Wellens, if we can figure out a better, the definition of random review, we are supportive of a definition, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just to clarify in response to Mr. Holland's comment, this review was drafted by potential amendment was drafted by council staff based on the NAACP's comments. I didn't want to put words in the mouth of, I didn't want to misrepresent that the NAACP had come up with this specific definition. So just to clarify that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know that was not theirs, but that's what they had in their public statement. So I agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let's move on to number 7, please.
Issue number 7 relates to civilian oversight of the IAD review. In the Racial Equity and Social Justice Statement, the Office of Legislative Oversight recommended that the bill be amended to provide for civilian oversight of IAD investigations. There wasn't a specific amendment recommended, and this is an issue in which I think the council's central staff's view is that this really does relate quite closely to the Maryland Police Accountability Act, and I believe it relates to the Police Accountability Board and administrative charging committees that will be formed. So the suggestion from central staff would be to fold this into a larger discussion. That's not necessarily this bill, but obviously, I defer to the committee and we'll take direction on how you'd like to move, Mr. Chair.
I believe it should be the larger discussion. However, I also believe if we can do it sooner than, I don't know the time frame for the Bill 670 under the state, but if we could do it in conjunction with that as quickly as possible, I think that would be helpful. Mr. Vice President Hocker or Vice President Albornoz, these titles have confused me here this morning for some reason. Either one of you have a comment, please.
A little bit of a complicated issue, but yeah, I favor in principle certainly doing it as quickly as possible. Absolutely.
Vice President Albornoz.
Yeah, I certainly agree, but obviously want to be reasonable that
Right.
We end up with a good product and don't rush it. But there is obviously some urgency here.
I would, if I could, Mr. Chair, I would note that this bill goes into effect with the state in July of 2022. And so you will have the civilian oversight that has to be put into place in the IAD process, though there still will be and Mr. Holland President Holland can also comment on this about our collective bargaining agreement that will still be in effect with the hearing board process, but that I believe that the hearing that the oversight boards will need to be created beginning July 1st of next year. And I think anything short of that that's going to be rushed, I think it's going to make it very complicated and convoluted to some degree about process. And I think we need to make sure that we're clear in that and where we're going. And as we are actively preparing and working with the county executive currently to be able to adhere to the state law that's coming into effect next year.
Thank you, and I appreciate the clarification. Mr. Holland.
I have nothing to add. I just, state laws, they can change too, right? They go back into session next year, so we could be doing things, not that we shouldn't be doing things and preparing for it, but things could change. Just remember that every year they're back in session, so there could be changes to the amendments and things of sorts. So we should prepare for what it is now, but of course things could change.
Okay. Unless there's further comment, I think we're gonna move on to number 8, but we appreciate it, and we're gonna have to continue to work on it and make certain that we're doing it the best way possible. Ms. Wellens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Issue number 8 also relates to state law. Well, not just to state law, but has some components of considering recent changes to the state law. The Racial Equity and Social Justice Statement had also recommended amending the bill to allow for civilian complainants to have access to certain body-worn camera recordings. And I believe some advocates also suggested, ensuring that civilians have access within as short a time period as possible. Obviously, this is an extremely important issue. I noted in the staff memorandum that this issue is addressed through the Anton's Law that the state just passed, which will be going into effect on October 1, 2021. And that gives greater access to the public of body-worn camera videos and in general, because it says that records of internal investigations are no longer necessarily personnel records that cannot be disclosed just point blank. There's greater discretion and greater discretion for the police department to provide those that information to the public, and so greater rights for the public to get that information. So I would just suggest that that's not to say that the committee or that the council is totally precluded in this area, but I do think that there is the potential of confusion if our law were to differ from the Anton's Law, and this particular state law is going into effect within a few months. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the reality is that even if we decided that we should change something, and I'm not suggesting that we do, but even if we did, we couldn't work faster than October 1st. I mean, candidly. So, I mean, there's a reality to that. And let's see how the Anton's Law, how it affects all of us, and then take it from there. That's my opinion. President Hucker, Vice President Albornoz, where are you, please? Okay, we got 2 thumbs up. Okay.
That seems realistic, yeah.
The next item, collective bargaining. There is a court case pending, and as long as that is pending at this moment, I believe we should revisit this topic after that court case is pending, unless there's other thoughts on that. But I don't know that we should be spending time at this moment discussing this. Okay, are we all right on that? See head shaking. Okay. Number 10, please, Ms. Wellens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This point number 10 was discussed previously, at least in part, that it relates to the use of body-worn cameras by plainclothes and undercover officers. So there's been a recommendation by the Silver Spring Justice Coalition that undercover officers, in addition to plainclothes officers, should be required to use body-worn cameras. The bill currently requires the issuance of body-worn cameras to police when they are on duty and they are wearing their uniform or displaying a badge or other prominent insignia. And the reason it was drafted that way was an attempt to make sure that that the bill conformed with the state Maryland Wiretapping and Electronic Surveillance Act, which really restricts the ability of anyone to, audio record in the state of Maryland without everybody's consent, except under certain specified enumerated circumstances. And one of those circumstances that the state law enumerates is if you are an officer who, you're working as an officer and you are wearing a uniform, or it's clear that you are a law enforcement officer. So obviously that's not necessarily the case. Well, it's not the case for undercover officers. The chief could perhaps speak to the plainclothes officers issue, but I think it's, as long as the plainclothes officer were wearing a badge or other prominent insignia, then yes, that's fine. And just to provide some additional context, I did want to note that the Silver Spring Justice Coalition and others, I believe, have brought to your attention the Gaithersburg City Police Department and their policies related to undercover officers. My reading of their policy is that it doesn't require use by undercover officers, but I did want to note that this is something that, especially if we have another work session, we can kind of close the loop on. I have reached out to the Gaithersburg City attorneys to try to get, clarity about their policy and to understand that, so that I can give the committee a fuller picture once I'm able to actually speak with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief, you had discussed this earlier, there is a difference between undercover and plain clothes and people wearing insignias and not, but did you have any further comment on this one?
Yeah, and I did, just for point of clarification. So we have undercover officers who are specifically working to address crimes in our community, to sort of infiltrate the underground, you might say, are black markets of criminal activity in our county. I believe it is highly risky. Myself, having served as an undercover officer for this county for several years and have engaged with illegal activity, that this is not something that we put on an officer in order to I think you put their lives in jeopardy when they do that. It is already a very dangerous position that they hold, and so I am adamantly against that. A plainclothes officer has a different area of responsibility, you may say. When we have officers, what we call in our special assignment team as an example, there are operations that they are on when they are making arrests or serving, assisting with search warrants or things of that nature. They are generally, when they are in those, in handling those types of responsibilities, they are actually having their badges displayed. Generally, their vests or jackets have police on them. So we want them to be recognizable when they're making in that operation mode. So we have other units that when they are actually investigative units that, again, I don't know if it's feasible when we say that we want every officer who has a badge showing to actually have we have detectives that spend an incredibly amount of time doing other activities, and are very few times are they actually involved in engaging in an arrest situation. But there are times that they are. There are others that the amount of time for them to walk around in a suit and tie wearing a body-worn camera, I don't know, we can have discussions about that. But I think the highest amount of accountability has always been those who are more engaged in high-risk type situations and or dealing with the public on a more constant basis. We have officers who do a myriad of jobs that have very little contact with the public, and some in their areas of responsibility. And I don't know the benefit of them having a body-worn camera to wear. Generally, if they're again sitting in the meetings all day or working behind the scenes at at our vehicle recovery section or something. Though they wear a uniform, they're actually dealing with a different responsibility.
Thank you. Mr. Holland.
I agree. We got to be mindful that, the special assignment teams, the plainclothes officers, they're plainclothes at one point and they can quickly show their badges very quickly. So we don't want to get in a point where, hey, as soon as I show a badge, I got to have a camera on me, because that means you're walking on the camera the entire time, right? So I think it's very careful how that's worded. I think the purpose of this was, at any time a police officer can be called in to work uniform, right? We saw this during the protests. We saw this during COVID, and our detectives and plainclothes officers don't have cameras assigned to them, so they didn't have a camera when they had to go out in uniform, and that was very concerning to my members, because they've fallen in love with these cameras because it ensures them something, that people are seeing what they see, somewhat, sometimes not, but it gives them a reassurance of things. So this is the part of the bill why I supported that everyone in uniform, if you're wearing a uniform while you're at work, should have a camera.
Thank you. President Hucker, did you? And then I'll get Vice President Albornoz.
No, I appreciate the advice I got on this. And just to elaborate on Mr. Holland's point, my understanding was, and maybe it was said, but that plainclothes officers sometimes have to change into a uniform because of a changing assignment during a shift change, but they didn't have access to a camera. So just making sure that that's available, I think, is a good thing, a good level of detail to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Vice President Albornoz.
Thank you. I just want to be crystal clear here, because this is an important point. Sometimes our conversations are taken out of context, and then there are rumors that the county council supports putting body-worn cameras on, people who are undercover. I know that I'm confident. I speak for my colleagues in ensuring everyone, especially our officers, that we in no way, shape, or form will support a piece of legislation that compromises critical investigations or put them at risk in any way, shape, or form. That's just, I want to make that crystal clear. I know that these investigations can be complex, having worked closely with the gang unit, both prior to becoming the director of the Department of Recreation, but then through ensuring the public safety of our residents. Those are complex investigations, and with significantly a lot at stake. And so I do think that they're within reason, for sure, particularly for plainclothes officers. There's an opportunity for us to go further, and I really appreciate Mr. Holland's comments because they reinforce what I saw when I was out in the field, which is that officers embrace these cameras, and within reason, to the degree to which we can extend their reach, it just helps further move transparency and help ensure that we continue to expand the critical community trust that's involved. But we're going to use reasonable as our barometer here as we go through this. But I do want to also note there would be value in a future work session, and I know this is near and dear to your heart, Mr. Chair, to have someone from Gaithersburg come and speak to their experiences with this and how they've deliberated over these issues. And I think that would be beneficial in the next round of discussion on this item especially, but probably there are a couple of others as well.
Thank you. Well said. I agree with everything you just said. We in our future work sessions on this topic, we should ask someone from Gaithersburg City. It's my understanding it was not legislation. It's part of the what the police themselves have determined how they would go forward. But we need to have clarification on that as well. And if we could, and I don't know that this is Ms. Wellens or Ms. Farag, but if we could find out how much we are missing for body-worn cameras to get to 100% of every uniform officer, maybe beyond that, if we, I don't know if you need how many other body-worn cameras we would need to get to 100% that everyone would have a body-worn camera, and how much it would cost and how fast we could do that, please, because it's very necessary and I think it's very helpful. Anything else, Ms. Wellens? Please. Yes, yeah, we have a number 11.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The number 11 is relatively brief, I believe. It relates to some technical edits that have been recommended from the county attorney's office. One fixes a typo. One changes the term review to investigate to better describe the role of IAD. And then there is a suggestion to insert the phrase "if known" after demographic information related to when demographic information is reported to the chief. Obviously, there are situations in which the demographic information may not be available to the department. So this final issue for today is simply to, whether to adopt these technical amendments.
I think they make sense. President Hucker, Vice President Almanaz, are we in agreement that these make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you, Ms. Wellens. Thank you very, very much. And the chief and Mr. Holland, we're going to have at least one more work session on this. Hopefully we can clear everything up in the next work session, but we'd like it to be as soon as possible. And there again, I think Vice President Almanaz said that we need to be reasonable, and we need to be reasonable here. But we'd like it as soon as possible so that we can start to work on many of these issues. Ms. Wellens, were you going to speak or?
No, I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Not a problem. President Hocker.
Additional. I just wanted to raise two things, and maybe we'll just come back to these next time. But I think there were a couple other recommendations from the Silver Spring Justice Coalition that were in the not in the memo. One was, and they both concerned reporting. One was that the idea that the chief should provide the council and the county exec annual reports describing the review process that was established and how it's performed. And another one was an annual report on IED investigations with a summary. I don't know if those have been written up into any form, but they seem reasonable to me and not so burdensome. But
well, only thing I would suggest, Mr. Hucker, we present an annual IED report. That's been the
that's right.
Functionality of this police department for quite some time.
That's
so
right.
We do that already.
Okay, thanks. Ms. Bowen, sorry.
Oh, sorry. President Hucker, I just wanted to add that just as an additional point on this, and obviously can gather more information and write it up as an amendment, but the reason that it hadn't been included in the memorandum was just that we have the separate bill pending, Bill 4520, related to police data and reporting. And I know that there are some recommendations related to that bill concerning IAD reporting. So, it might make more sense to have that discussion in terms of Bill 4520 as opposed to this bill. Although, we could do it in both. We just need to make sure that we're making parallel changes.
You're right. Now it's coming back to me. It's been a little while since we drafted all this. Thanks so much for the reminder. That's all I got, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Vice President Almanaz, anything else?
Nope, I'm good.
Thank you. Ms. Wellens, thank you very much, Chief, and Mr. Holland, thank you all for joining us. We will have another work session on this. Hopefully at that point we can get to making some suggestions to the full council. So